The year is 1996, and Mexico's left-wing party is due to elect its new leader. With only 8 years since having become a relevant political force, and with 2 out of 2 presidential elections lost, the party is seeking a new direction. The choice has come down to 2 men. One is a towering figure of Mexico's historic left, former presidential candidate, respected intellectual, academic, inventor, and posthumous winner of the highest honor awarded by the Mexican government. The other man, the man who will win, is 25 years younger. His only experience is politics. His ideology is thin and often cliched. But there is no doubt that he is a savvy politician. 15 years later, this man will found his own party. In 2018, he will win the presidency. And by 2024, the party he created will hold 75% of Mexico's states, 75% of Congress, 2/3 of the Senate, and once more, the presidency. This man is Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
You've given us a great idea into the sort of legendary nature of this man, Thabo. And yet, I'd go even further, because you've given us a few good stats about how much he won. Great landslide. But this was a landslide like no other, because it completely transformed the Mexican political landscape forever. It destroyed it to a certain extent, and it built a new one in another. I think for American listeners, maybe, a lot of people hate Ronald Reagan, a lot of people hate FDR, but no one denies that they created a new era in American politics. I think we can say the same of this man. And this man believes that he is that person. There's no other reason for him to say that this is the fourth age of Mexican politics. That is La Cuarta Transformación. That is independence, the Benito Juárez reforms, the revolution, and now him. This is the founding father of the fourth age of Mexican public life.
This is the story of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Mexican president from 2018 to 2024. When one talks to Mexicans about López Obrador today, he's usually referred to as López Obrador or AMLO. Business people in general, people from the right, people often living abroad from Mexico, particularly in universities and as expats, they will tell you that this man is nothing short of the devil. He's here to destroy the country. Some of these people publish articles in the likes of the Financial Times, the Washington Post, saying pretty much that. But when you go to Mexico and you talk to the majority of people, that is not what people say. What's more, a large chunk of that majority will tell you that this man is not only not the devil, but he's nothing short of the Messiah. So which one is it? And I can't help but think that the answer must lie somewhere in between.
Absolutely. And crucially, he's such a polarizing figure to such extremes that you can't really start to pass out the man himself. And it's so important to understand who this man is, ultimately, because he's created this new 21st century Mexico, for better and for worse. So I'm glad that you're giving us that context before we dive into the life and times of this man, like literally what created this monumental force of Mexican politics.
Well, it all really starts in the late 90s, and more importantly, in the year 2000. So why is this moment in time particularly important? Because López Obrador goes from being someone important within a secondary party to becoming the mayor of Mexico City, the capital of a G20. And not only the capital, but Mexico City is particularly important in Mexico. Unlike DC in the US, where many things happen in DC, but many things don't happen in DC. So finance happens in New York, innovation often in San Francisco. Mexico City is very much like Paris or Madrid or London. So much of decision-making, so much of the money, so much of everything happens in Mexico City. And this man is now the mayor of that city.
Throughout our conversation about López Obrador, one of the things we'll continuously come across is something completely unsurprising, which is the man may be a political genius or a political devil, but to be either, you need to be very, very savvy. But also, he is completely the product of contingency. And luckily, because he tried to do so many things so often, that is, run for power, take control of his party, all these sorts of things happen repeated times, you get to see how historical and political contingency at any one time changes his destiny trying for the same thing.
And the political contingency at this time is the fact that in the year 2000, which is when he becomes mayor, Mexico has gone through a variety of momentous changes. So, of course, this man becoming the mayor of Mexico City is one of them, but his party had already held the mayorship of Mexico City in the past. But at this time also, you have Mexico's right-wing government in power for the first time at the level of the presidency. And more importantly, the PAN, the right-wing party, has taken the presidency away from the PRI that had held the presidency for over 70 years. Now, when you go back and try to research, as we did for this podcast, what was happening at the time, it's really important to note that both of us grew up during this time. And as you go back and read on what actually happened, it's really difficult to disentangle the narrative of what we heard, growing up versus the closest thing that we have to fact. Because, of course, this is still very recent, so a lot of things are very contentious. But narrative and fact contradict each other often. And it's very difficult throughout López Obrador's career to disentangle the narrative and the image of the man from the things that he actually did. And moreover, the things that he actually did can be seen from multiple lenses. Is this man a socialist fighting for justice in a country that's profoundly unjust, particularly at a financial equality level? Or is he a populist? Is he just hungry for power? When we look at his work as mayor, he has an enormous number of successes. So let's start off by saying, very simply, that the man leaves his position as mayor with 84% approval rating, which is extraordinary. As I said, the right wing and the business people of Mexico do not like him today. But a lot of that right wing and those business people live in Mexico City. And yet, 84% of Mexico City approved of his work as mayor. He did an enormous number of things, and he's loved by many for a variety of reasons. He spends a colossal amount of money, around $5 billion in direct cash transfers to underprivileged people. But it's not just about populism. It's not just about direct cash transfers. He also is very savvy, very good at working not only with the private sector, but also with civil society. During his time, Mexico City is very much transformed. So for those of you who have visited Mexico City, you'll go to the historic downtown and see this beautiful place. The Alameda is this beautiful historic park, the oldest urban park in the American continent.
It wasn't like that before.
Not at all. I remember growing up not going to the Alameda because it was dangerous. It was dirty. It was just a horrible place. It had been taken over by street vendors, and it was quite unsafe. And that was much of Mexico's historic downtown. This World Heritage Site was really not well taken care of. It was dangerous and it was dirty. But by the time he leaves, and slightly after, but very much as a result of his policies, Mexico's historic downtown is completely transformed to the wonder that it is today. And that happens throughout the city. It happens also with Chapultepec Park, the largest urban park in the world today. And what we see there is a man who has a vision, and that vision is social. He wants to create things that many can share in and many can enjoy. And he's happy to work with all sides and in all forms and ways to get there.
This is also an inheritance from his previous life as a priista, which is the sort of funny thing about this moment in time. We talk about López Obrador as the great opponent of the established powers, but he was part of that machinery before. In the 70s, he joined the PRI to be a local politician. But by the time he's in Mexico City, he's very distant from them. He's suffered a number of fraudulent elections, and so he hates them with all his heart, but he's still carrying out a lot of what he does using their old handbook. Crucially, And I think this explains a lot of what you're saying, Tabo. There is a lot of work done with people he should naturally hate as a leftist. Business people, Carlos Slim specifically in the downtown area. But these people understand, both the business people and the politicians who grew up in the PRI, that you work together behind the scenes. Maybe you throw dirt at each other in public, but behind the scenes, especially with the private sector, you work to make them some money, and they work to build you the infrastructure you need. And I think there's a lot of upper class populism under López Obrador. We talk a lot about the cash handouts, but I think there's no greater cash handout than this mobility project that he created, not the metro bus, this sort of big slinky bus that you see in Mexico, but the second floor of this massive ring road that goes around Mexico City, the Periférico. That massive ring road was already pretty saturated by the time López Obrador got there. And so what he decided was, against every urbanist's advice across the world, as South Korea and other more sort of intelligent countries when it comes to urbanism were tearing down these second, elevated highways, second floor of the Periférico was built. And that was a symbol for López Obrador. But ironically, it was a symbol where he said, look at how wonderful this is. Everyone can now use a car, except for the fact that 80% of people in Mexico don't use a car. This was a handout, but for the rich, those who own a car and those who would have loved the fact that they could get on a different road above everyone else and zoom across what used to be a very saturated road. By the way, the reason it's a terrible idea is that second floor is now completely saturated.
And it was saturated very quickly, to be honest. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that he is supposed to be or represent a new world, a new age, a new party, definitely. But he ultimately cannot help representing or showing that he grew up in a particular environment. And there's a quip that's often said by economists about governments during the 20th century in Mexico, and that's that it seems that the success of an administration would be measured based on how many tons of cement they'd used during their administration. And I think that is what López Obrador does. He goes to university in the 70s when there's these huge infrastructure projects being created all over Latin America. And to him, that is success. That is, if I spend a lot on big infrastructure projects, if I mix a lot of concrete, basically, I'm doing my job well, and I am bringing about great economic development, independently of the recommendations they get, independently of whether it's actually going to work.
Wonderful bit of foreshadowing there for his presidency, but go on.
Indeed. Now, so far we're seeing he did some things that are ideologically questionable. He's a pragmatist, one might say. He's a populist, one might say. But the image of him looks relatively positive. Now, what are really the criticisms that appear or that can be said of his administration? Not that many. So when you look at the facts, he not everything was perfect. There were failures, for sure. Most clearly, you can say that he, particularly for underprivileged people, his focus was very populist. It was very much a give you the fish, not teaching you how to fish idea. Whereas the rich were giving something that was going to continue to produce money for them. For example, for Carlos Slim, who made an enormous amount of money when he was allowed to develop an entirely new neighborhood, basically, where his offices now stand. But beyond that, what are the big concerns? So one of them, obviously, is security. During his administration, kidnappings are through the roof, and they continue all the way to 2008, 2009. Is that his fault? Is that the legacy of the 80s or the 90s? Unclear. Should he have done more? Unclear. But what can definitely be said is that there's a variety of corruption scandals that start to creep up during his administration. Most famously, the case of a man called Bejarano, famously known as, or referred to as, the man of the elastic bands, because there's a video that came out of him asking for elastic bands so that he could tie up these bundles of cash that he was being given illegally. And this came out because Bejarano was AMLO's private secretary at the time. So it was said that, this is how corrupt this new government is, and this is what this man really stands for. Now, it seems incredibly convenient that a man from the left, a party that is relatively new, and who's doing all these seemingly good things, or at least not bad things, would suddenly have his private secretary be caught with a very obvious video of him taking cash illegally. How does this happen? Mexico's a country with a lot of corruption, but these videos don't come up every day. So how does it happen to him?
They're professionals. They're professional corrupt people.
Exactly. This is institutional corruption. It's not easy to get caught for this to end up on camera and for this then to make it onto national television and become the level of scandal that it became. So why did it become that? And call this a conspiracy theory, maybe it sounds a bit like it, but it also stands to reason. Because at this time, the president belonged to the conservative party in Mexico, Vicente Fox. He comes into the presidency at the same time as López Obrador comes into his position as mayor. And Vicente Fox hates López Obrador. They could not be more different. Vicente Fox was a former Coca-Cola executive. He's a marketing man. He's a businessman. He believes in neoliberalism and globalization and capitalism above all. And the word socialism is an insult to him. So, of course, AMLO is the worst thing that could happen to the country. And he makes that very clear throughout the 6 years that he is president. He at one point calls him a danger to Mexico publicly as president and says that I will not allow him to become president.
This is something that really is worth underscoring. The hatred of Vicente Fox for Andrés Manuel López Obrador is so great that he's very brazen about how much he publicly talks about how much he is willing to legally, and he always says legally, stop this man from becoming Mexico's next president.
Now, where did this come from? I believe it's mostly just being at odds ideologically. Fox, in general, had an issue with anything that was even marginally to the left. He famously called Fidel Castro to tell him that at an event where he had been invited before and where he was usually allowed to just be there as a normal head of state, he said to him, you're gonna be allowed to come. However, you're going to eat and you're going to leave. Because that was his idea. I don't need to put up with you. He said, te comes y te vas. Okay. And of course, there's a variety of things that go on during this very public feud between Fox and AMLO. And at one point, the biggest thing that happens is that Fox tries to and succeeds in taking away AMLO's sort of...
It's an impeachment, isn't it?
Indeed, it's an impeachment. He manages to impeach him, to take away the sort of judicial protection that elected officials have in Mexico. And he does that and publicly said he's doing that to avoid him becoming president. However, the decision is incredibly unpopular, even within his party. And he finally says, all right, we're not going to do that. The attorney general for the country resigns shortly after and goes away very silently. But all of this gives AMLO an enormous amount of A, visibility, B, it creates the content that AMLO needs to begin to tell a story about how the powers that be are secretly out to get him. That there is...
Because this is a crucial changing point for López Obrador. Before then, it was the corrupt PRI, the authoritarian sort of regime, and obviously it was easy to pin that hatred on a clearly authoritarian regime, whereas the PAN, though it was right-wing, was relatively unscathed. They were just as innocent, we'll say, as they came into power alongside López Obrador. And, crucially, when there had been fraud in López Obrador's home state of Tabasco, the PAN had actually come out and supported his claims against the PRI. But this is the creation, and I think this is what you're getting at, Tabo, the creation of what López Obrador would forevermore called the PRIAN, which is a combination of PRI and PAN, which for many years people used to say, what a silly comparison to make, until, of course, as we'll see later on, these two parties handed him that narrative on a silver platter. But we'll get back to that in a sec.
So eventually, the presidency of Fox ends, and AMLO's position as mayor ends, and it's time for a new president to be elected. And AMLO, who so far has seen a meteoric rise through the Mexican political scene, he becomes the PRD's, the left-wing party's candidate for the presidency. And his slogan, or one of his slogans during that candidacy, is his face, his cartoon of his face, giving a thumbs up and saying, "We're going to win." Who's we it's not necessarily the party. It's this, in the same way that there's a PRIAN, this evil sort of center and right wing, out to get us group of people, there is also we who have suffered, we who have struggled under the PRIAN, and it is we who are going to win.
We the people.
Indeed. However, he doesn't win. Or at least that's the official line. Now, I personally believe that he did not win. However, it's one of those things that it was a little bit too close for comfort. He loses by a margin of around 0.6%. Usually when you get a margin of 0.5%, you immediately go to a recount. This is 0.6%. And when you start looking at things, there's a fair number of irregularities. First of all, and this has always happened in Mexican democracy or pseudo-democracy across the 20th century, there are attempts by other parties to stop people who are going to vote against a particular side from voting. There's questions around the correct counting of the votes, that some of the urns are lost. There's all of these questions, which usually don't matter if you win by a margin of 10%. But if you win by a margin of 0.6%, then it starts being problematic.
With the president of the republic being openly against you.
Of course. And that's the other big thing. Vicente Fox and basically his buddies. So a thing called the Consejo Empresarial, the business people's council, essentially, were very public in trying to stop AMLO from becoming president. And what follows from AMLO's response is, I'd like to think of it very much as a tantrum. He says, this is outrageous. They've stolen the election from us. We will not stand for this. And he takes Reforma, which is sort of Mexico City's Champs-Élysées, and he says, we are going to stand here until democracy is done justice. We demand that the courts review this election. We demand that the votes are recounted. And we will sit here until we hear from the courts. So he does that, and the courts come back and they say, you are correct. What President Fox did was illegal, and his buddies, what they did was illegal. However, it does not constitute reason enough for us to recount all the votes. And what does he do? Throw an even bigger tantrum. He goes to Mexico's Central Square, to the Zócalo, and he proclaims himself the legitimate president of Mexico.
Now, we've got a bit more foreshadowing here, because I think it's more or less at this time where he says something that lots of people clutch their pearls at, which was, to hell with your institutions. Because this is the moment, again, in the same way we saw the creation, the origin story of the PRIAN, this is where we start to see the origin story of what Americans might call the deep state, and what López Obrador calls the neoliberal institutions that are out there, unelected, controlling the state, and stopping actual democracy and representation from happening, right? I mean, this is classic Mexico, of course. 0.6% instead of 0.5%, and even though a lot of illegal stuff happened, sorry, the law says we can't do anything, and so off you go. And clearly, that is unacceptable for López Obrador. Mostly, of course, because he's on the losing side of this. And so we've got a little bit of the foreshadowing of what we'd see many years later under his administration, of the dismantling of what he saw as clearly corrupt elites controlling the apparatus of the state.
However, as much as he does think that there is this, as in his words, complot, this plot against him, he still believes in the institutions enough to give it another go. So for 6 years, he does nothing but complain and say that the election was indeed stolen, that he should be president. But fast forward to 2012, he says, okay, let's give this another shot. We're going to believe in these institutions again, and we will run again. But the people love me. The people demand that a left-wing government come to power. So the people will obviously vote for me. He runs again, and he loses again. But what's really interesting here is that 1 year before he runs and loses, he creates not a party officially then, but he creates a movement which is called Movimiento Regeneración Nacional, the Movement for National Regeneration. And allegedly it's created with the purpose of defending democracy, of defending the vote for the next year. However, the moment that he loses, he does something that at this point seems like a constant with him. He throws the tantrum of a lifetime. And quoting a variety of other reasons, most importantly, a thing called the Pacto por México, the Pact for Mexico, in which his party decides to go into a pact with the now ruling party or the newly elected party. And he says, I will not stand for this. And he leaves.
It's all very convenient for López Obrador at this time, I think, because there's nothing better than to be an aggrieved member of the opposition in a country that needs to be governed. During this time, we've seen Fox come in and basically a pretty ineffective government. Then we see Felipe Calderón, who wins in 2006, another politician who unleashes the criminality of the Mexican drug war, as we discussed in a previous podcast, very much linked to this legitimacy crisis of the election. And then in 2012, we've got this wonderful, they're almost like perfectly illustrative moments in Mexican history, because in 2012, it's no longer about politics, it's about money. The PRIs come back to power. They've won by about 6%. So López Obrador can't say he was cheated out of that very last bit of the vote. He loses by a fair margin, which he still claims was a fraud. But this time he says it was because the business class and the moneyed interests were behind the PRI's return. They gave out money, they gave out airtime on television, and they created this presidential candidate that was completely corrupt to his core. But to be honest, when you look at López Obrador at this time, this is his most erratic age. This is the age where lots of people are very scared of him, because even though he's always advocating for non-violent protest, which I think is very respectable, he never calls the army to come out to the streets and support him. He very un-Latin American, but very respectable. But his rhetoric gets increasingly angry, and people can really detect that. And so you can see the sort of middle-class worry creeping into the voters, which I think explains a lot of why he lost so decisively in 2012.
I mean, already since 2006, his campaign is very much us and them, but within the realm of reason, within the realm of institutions. 2012, it's a little bit more of the same, but by late 2012, this is completely, it sounds like a crazy person talking about how they faked the moon landing. He says, everyone's out to get me. He's saying things that don't really make sense. He's saying that there was widespread fraud everywhere, that we can't even believe that 6% that margin by which he lost. It's all a big plot against him and against the Mexican people.
And just to be clear, there was a lot of corruption. So what I think I'm saying is we can't unpick what was the genuine resentment against the man who blocked Reforma, the man who's insulting our democratic institutions. Surely lots of people went against him in that election. But then lots of people surely were bought out of their vote and forced to vote by the PRI's machinations and political apparatus across the country, and by the campaign that happened across the media throughout the presidential campaign. So I think that's what's difficult about this conversation. The people who hate him say he's a paranoid loon who always thinks that people are out to get him until he wins, and then it was completely legitimate. And then there's the other side, which says he's always been cheated because he is the true voice of the people. As you said at the beginning, it looks like the real answer is somewhere in between.
Now, when he leaves his party, and he seems to have completely lost his mind, the years that follow, it seems that his importance is just going to fizzle out. He's going to disappear after having been almost president of Mexico, after having been the force from the left for several years now.
He does kind of disappear, doesn't he? I remember very clearly just looking at the news, and it was never López Obrador. He was always chatting away, but no one really listened to him, it feels. The most iconic moment of him during the Peña Nieto tenure, 2012 to 2018, before the campaign, that is, was him sort of walking around a lovely, like, colonial city chasing a pigeon. Like, that was the most iconic moment for López Obrador in the early stages of that presidency, starting in 2012.
And to be fair, that picture does look like he's completely lost it.
Very Biden, I remember.
Indeed. Now, in line with what you're saying, we would hear in the news every once in a while, like, oh, López Obrador is doing this in Tabasco, he's doing that in Sonora. But it was also kind of like, isn't he gone? Isn't it over? This movement that he had officially begun in 2011, by 2014, becomes a party. However, the people who join him at the beginning of that party are generally a bunch of no ones. One of his biggest allies, who actually he's his protege, and he becomes the next mayor of Mexico City after him. He does not join him. It seems that he's going to run for president in 2018. So at the beginning, there's this party that sort of no one really thinks is going to go anywhere.
It's nobody's,
and how wrong we were.
Yeah, it's nobody's like Adán Augusto López, Ricardo Monreal, Claudia Sheinbaum, all these names that really back then were pretty irrelevant names. They were big within sort of left-wing politics, but pretty irrelevant. Of course, I'm hinting at the fact that all these people who are the core of Morena, who stuck with López Obrador from the very beginning in his darkest times, become incredibly powerful people in this new age of Mexican politics.
And so we fast forward to 2018. It's been 6 years of the PRI having come back to power. Enrique Peña Nieto's government starts off very promisingly and finishes, quite frankly, a disaster. And López Obrador is running again. At this point, you have had 18 years of new governments, let's say, 12 years of the PAN, a completely different party, a return now to the PRI, and 18 years of democracy and 18 years of disappointments.
And terrible calamities. This is the drug war. This is Mexico simply not picking up its economic growth. It's enormous corruption scandals of the likes that we hadn't seen even under the PRI to some extent.
And so he runs for the presidency. And in his campaign, the man that comes to the fore is a changed man. And the evidence of that is, he'd always been a little bit quirky, but what we see in the first debate, there's a moment that I'll never forget where the right-wing candidate, Ricardo Anaya, starts listing a whole set of arguments against López Obrador, against his past administration, against the people that he was surrounded by. And instead of responding with anything that made any sense, he just responded with a little rhyme saying, Ricky, Riquín, Canallín. And everyone laughed. It was a meme for the ages. And it still is. The questions and points were not addressed in the least. They were very relevant points. And we moved on. And with an enormous majority, or with a very clear majority, he wins that election.
But wait, okay, so I'd like to stand up a bit for the changed man we're talking about, because the quirkiness, the man was always quirky, he was always quite funny and folksy, but there was a definite change in his person and in his strategy. So gone are the days of anger for López Obrador. He really tones it down. He wants to be a more conciliatory figure, because I think despite the claims of fraud, he understood that he lost the election of 2012 and that there was no really other way of skinning that cat. So what he did during his years in the wilderness, and I think this is such an important lesson for anyone doing politics or anything, was that even though we were all addicted to social media by then, even though the television was still running strong, it got Peña Nieto, the pre-candidate, elected in 2012, but the media landscape was changing, and maybe it was less effective than we thought it was, because as López Obrador was in the wilderness, out of sight and out of mind, he was actually building something much more potent than a little movement. He was going to every single one of Mexico's over 2,000 municipalities and shaking hands and doing meetings and rallies and just meeting up with Mexico. Of course, we've got this context of everyone knows the face of these terrible politicians in power, the PAN and the PRI, but it's not enough to have people you hate in power. You need someone to rally around. And he created that movement on the ground. And I think that's such an important lesson for us to learn, because by the time he's back in power, I mean, by the time he's back on the campaign trail, he's got this massive movement with a very coordinated message. And even though it's quite incipient, Morena as a party is a formidable organization that wins him the election by an enormous landslide. People used to say throughout the 21st century, López Obrador and the left have a limit of about 30% of the Mexican electorate. Only about 30% of Mexicans are left-wing, which is the way people used to see it. That's the only reason you'd ever vote for López Obrador, a left-wing person. But by the time you get to 2018 and people are fed up with the Mexican government and the parties, the other parties, this man wins by over 50%. An enormous landslide of the likes that no one had ever seen in democratic Mexican politics. There was no such thing as a political roof for López Obrador. The context had created this perfect storm for him to rise to power in a way that he would never have done in 2006 and 2012. So to be honest, I almost feel he should be thankful for all the fraud and all the terrible slip-ups he made, because no way, Jose, would he have ever reached the amount of power that he got and the political capital that he controlled in any of the other two elections.
Yeah, I think what you're saying hits the nail on the head, because his approach of going out into the municipalities, the far and distant municipalities, and shaking hands shouldn't have gotten him very far. That's not the way politics worked in Mexico. Decisions were made in Mexico City. Sure, you do a little bit of a tour throughout the different states, but that's not how politics was done. But it goes to show the degree to which the Mexican administrations had failed the citizens of the country for such a long time, that this man going around and shaking people's hand and saying, I care, was enough to turn things around, was enough to give him that mass followership all over the country. And indeed, as we said at the beginning, Morena, his party, today holds 3/4 of all the states in the country and is a relevant player in absolutely every single state.
Absolutely. So we get to the López Obrador tenure, which is 2018 to 2024. He's just left power, enormously popular still, having won alongside Claudia Sheinbaum, his protege, an even bigger landslide. And the question is, how did we actually get there? Was he actually a good president? And we don't want to really focus on the party or his tenure, because we're focusing in on the man, right? The symbol that is López Obrador. And I think is the right word, because we lose López Obrador in 2018. Not mentally, even though some people thought we'd lost him long before, but in a different way. López Obrador was a man in the political wilderness, surrounded by very, very few people, hardcore political allies. But as soon as it becomes clear before the election that he's going to win, people didn't understand it was going to be such a landslide, but people knew this man is going to win. Like rats jumping from a ship, every other party started to hemorrhage people, politicians who would run over to Morena and say, I would like to be part of your campaign. Now, any sensible person would say, of course not. You're one of the corrupt people from the old regime. We're trying to replace you. But there's sensible and there's very sensible. There's pragmatic, where you need to build a movement that can actually take on government. And Morena was very, very new at the time and relatively small in terms of its, we'll call it its political cadres. It had a lot of support, but a smallish amount of professional politicians who would have to go on and take on the positions of government. They were sweeping across the nation. And so there was a lot of use to co-opting people who could come into the party with their name, local bigwigs, people with big machineries in local parts of the state. They didn't know they're going to win by that amount. So they said, if we're going to win this, we need everyone we can get on board. Very pragmatic, but also perhaps the beginning of the end, even before they'd even started, right? The corruption of Morena, getting these terrible people, like, just to show you the degree of the madness of the people they adopted into the movement, was a man who would become the leader of the Federal Commission of Electricity, a big, important post in Mexico. That man was Manuel Bartlett, who was in charge of the electoral system in 1988, one of the biggest campaigns in Mexican history, where the left almost won, with obviously López Obrador supporting it. And he was the man who was clearly in charge of rigging the election. And he was now in the López Obrador cabinet, basically. But that didn't matter because López Obrador created something new, which was this new icon of himself. He'd been elected to save Mexico, and he was going to do it. And one of the most important things about saving Mexico was to redeem all its sins. There's such religious iconography throughout this story that we haven't mentioned, starting from the name of the party, Morena. Morena, of course, is Movimiento Regeneración Nacional, but it's also what you call the Virgin of Guadalupe. And she, along with the rest of the religious apparatus of the party, could cleanse you of your sins if you just joined. And that was how a lot of the politicians who came from other parties were redeemed when they were absorbed into the Morena apparatus.
To that point, the separation of church and state in Mexico is a particularly important thing. For decades, presidents in Mexico would not talk about their own religion. They would not talk about religion at all. They would not use religious iconography. But López Obrador is perfectly happy to use it over and over again. When asked, for example, about his own religion, he said, "I believe in Jesus because Jesus is love and Jesus is justice." And of course, he's speaking to an electorate that is very, very Christian and very, very Catholic.
And he's used it in such an intelligent way that we actually don't even know what religion he is. A lot of people say he's an evangelical. Some people say he's whatever. I think what's interesting here is he knows how to use iconography. It's government through symbolism. The symbolism that rejects this positivist neoliberal way of doing government, which is dry, professorial, these are the facts. No, your facts are useless in a world where they can be corrupted by institutions. You need to inspire the people. And what's funny is it kind of works to an extent. What I thought was incredible at the beginning of the López Obrador tenure was how little power he had in Congress and how much political capital he was able to wield in a new way of doing politics. The most humiliatingly successful policy that he instituted, or series of policies, humiliating for the opposition, was his reduction of poverty. Over the course of his tenure, he reduced poverty by about 5 million people, with the COVID pandemic in between. And what was humiliating, I think, for the opposition was it contradicted all the received knowledge that the opposition had told Mexicans was the case, and it worked far better. So instead of conditioning cash transfers to working class people, López Obrador just gave them money. And in the same way that the previous government said, no, you've got to condition it, because basically they said, you need to prove you're a good person, almost morally right to receive the state's money. And López Obrador said, just take the money. And beyond it being obviously wonderful for these people, I think it'd be an understatement to say he just bribed them, because that's not true. It was people finally getting money in a very low salary country. And he actually was able to grow, in the age of Trump, the economy through internal consumption, which was something that hadn't happened for decades in Mexico. And it benefited local business as opposed to international massive companies. And it also benefited massive international companies. I mean, Walmart was delighted by López Obrador because people were out buying stuff at the shops. Same thing with the minimum wage. For years, we were told Mexico's only competitive in the North American NAFTA and then USMCA context because we pay poverty wages. This is the only way Mexicans can compete against these very high-tech, industrialized Americans. López Obrador comes in and says, what if we just put the salaries up? What if we double the salaries? And he worked with the private sector, and horrifyingly, I think, the private sector said, actually, it's perfectly feasible. It's completely feasible for us to double the wages. It was just them pocketing it. And this is where he's proved right against this terrible, corrupt system. Maybe it isn't neoliberalism. It's this corrupt crony capitalism that had grown in Mexico that held down the poor and put money into the pockets of the rich. We've discussed this in the previous podcast about why Mexico is so poor and unequal. But it's worth underlining what happened under this administration.
And this will be a recurring theme in his presidency. He will take on a discourse that undermines fact, very Trumpian in that sense, but then he will do something that really should have been done a long time before, that makes sense, that only fancy economists with fancy degrees said that wouldn't work. And then, of course, it did work. But this was a very simple reality. People needed money to eat, to maybe not to eat because Mexico's not a country with a starvation problem, but people needed money to have that extra little thing that would make things so much easier. They need that extra bit of money to go to the movies, to just be able to enjoy their weekend. Of course, it's going to get the economy moving. It gives people something that they want and something that they can easily inject back into the economy in a productive way.
Absolutely. Of course, this government by symbolism did have terrible repercussions in other spaces. We've talked about the violence issue in Mexico in another podcast, so I'll basically just mention briefly that Mexico and violence continue to be synonymous. 20 of the 50 most violent cities on earth continue to be Mexican after López Obrador. There is no doubt that violence and the continuation of violence under his regime were a massive, massive failure for his government. Because he didn't change what the previous governments were doing. And we've discussed why we think that might be in the previous podcast. Go listen to that. But I think it's really important to see that where López Obrador held steady with the previous government's strategies, he failed massively. But he also failed massively in other cases in a more complicated and sort of sinister way. I think COVID is such an important case study for this because López Obrador did everything that people and the experts said you shouldn't do during a global pandemic. He didn't impose curfews. He didn't invest heavily. He actually cut a lot of spending. And so going against the grain, he managed to do something pretty terrible, which was Mexico's far ahead compared to other countries in the world in terms of the mortality rate. And yet, Mexico in the past post-COVID years has not fallen victim to what every other country that acted very swiftly and decisively has suffered, from Argentina to the United States to across Europe. You've seen the rise of extremist parties, often in the far right, that have come out because of COVID. They said there's no money, and so it must be migrants and not the massive amounts of debt governments incurred to keep people afloat during the pandemic. They curtailed our freedoms by locking us up. That's what Javier Milei keeps saying 5 years after the pandemic, but it still resonates across. You stole our children's best years at school and university. People are really angry at this so-called sensible this so-called sensible policy. And it was sensible. Lots more people died in Mexico. And yet the dead don't vote, which is a horrible thing to say, but you can see how the Morena movement has bucked every single trend when it comes to the anti-incumbent trend across the world over these past years.
And it's clear that AMLO is not generally very academically intelligent, but he is very sharp. And moreover, he is a student of history, and he learns from history. And something that must be noted is that Felipe Calderón, who's in power from 2006 to 2012, faces the swine flu. And Felipe Calderón does the exact opposite of what AMLO did. He followed the rule book to the letter. He went to the WHO. The WHO said you should do this, this, and this. He did exactly that. The swine flu turned out to not be particularly relevant. And you know what happened? The economy was hit because he stopped the economy almost entirely for a short period of time. Most importantly, the people who were hit the most were the people who live on a day-to-day basis. And AMLO, another thing that he has is that probably of all recent Mexican presidents, he is by far the one most cognizant of the reality of the average Mexican. He probably did know that not following WHO recommendations was going to lead to death. But he also knew that if you stop the economy in a country where a huge percentage of people depend on day-to-day economic activity, that will have its own disastrous consequences as well. So by virtue of not following the recommendations of WHO and being lucky enough that COVID didn't turn out to be an all-out apocalypse, he came out with pretty good standing.
And he used that actual capital that he saved during the pandemic and his political capital to boost his standing towards the end of his tenure. So throughout his presidency and during the campaign, he campaigned on Republican austerity. The government was frivolous, and no one needed to earn that much money if you're in politics because you did it as a public service. You didn't need to spend that much money, and the savings would be plugged back into the people's pockets. That's where the handouts came out, he said. But that disappears towards the end of his tenure. Massive investment and expenditure projects across Mexico to boost the economy and boost the chances of his chosen successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, of winning the presidency. I think it's a case study in masterful, if not slightly brutal, political strategy. Because Claudia Sheinbaum, just a few months ago, won the election in an even bigger landslide than López Obrador did, in a completely unexpected way. She comes into power not only with a larger margin of victory, but also with a supermajority, along with their allies, that could change the constitution. And that's the reality we're living in now. This AMLO-created political world governed by his creatures, both in the shape of Claudia Sheinbaum, who I think is more independent than people think he is of him, and of his main creature, the Morena party, which now completely governs all of Mexico, basically, all the vast majority of local congresses and the national congress as well, which makes them able to change the constitution at their whim. And what they're trying to do is, if López Obrador completely changed the way you do politics and gain power in Mexico, his inheritors are now changing the way the Mexican state exists as. Mexico will not be the same after López Obrador, and it'll definitely not be the same after this bout of massive constitutional changes. The main and most controversial one being a world first, which is on June 1st, every single, well, not that on that day, but over the next few years, every single judge and magistrate across Mexico at the local and federal levels will be directly elected by the people, which could result in lots of new democracy, hooray, or terrible, terrible instability. But that is all wrought of López Obrador. But he, I feel, is almost safe from that. He's now gone into the distance. He's done this wonderful, very effective thing, which is he's completely detached from the media. We literally haven't seen López Obrador for the past few months under Claudia Sheinbaum's government. So he's become a symbol beyond himself. And I think that's maybe where we end this story. Because López Obrador is still alive and kicking. He's writing books. He's still in people's minds. But he's also beyond that now. He's a man who's gone into Mexican legend. And for better or for worse, that will continue to affect Mexican politics for the rest of time.